Hello, this is Fabio Rambelli at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Today I'm going to talk about something that is quite unusual in my repertoire of talks, and also something that is quite unusual in discussions about the history of Gagaku. And I'm referring to the topic that I have presented here, the history of Gagaku in California. Um, I will try to emphasize that California is a unique place because it's probably the only place that I know of outside of Japan where Gagaku has long history, about 100 years, in which it is being performed, as Gagaku in its classical forms, and also um, many people, many composers and musicians have used Gagaku to create new music. And in fact, it would appear that the earliest attempts to use Gagaku elements for the creation of new contemporary music uh, began in California, and that happened before such a movement, such tendencies developed in Japan. So I have presented a relatively lengthy PowerPoint, and I will be discussing only the main points. So feel free to stop the video anytime, and if you think would like to read the slides more carefully. This is the table of content. In my presentation, I've tried to bring together several threads belonging to different fields that are normally not discussed together. So, one field is the Western discovery of Gagaku and the adoption of Gagaku elements by Western composers and musicians to create new compositions. The other one is another topic is the role of Japanese American communities here in California and the fact that they did have and performed Gagaku in the early part of the 20th century live again here in California, which is something that is normally ignored or not very well explored. Then there is the issue of the mediators, the human interfaces that made this discovery of Gagaku possible and also made possible the development of new musics based on Gagaku elements. A lot of these mediators are in Japan, but again, something also um, happened here in California that was very influential for later developments. Um, and finally, I will present some conclusions, or rather open conclusions, about the role of Gagaku as carrier of cultural heritage and token of cultural identity. And I would like to begin to problematize, what kind of heritage Gagaku carries, for whom, and about what, and what kind of identity it can represent in our time of global interconnectedness and transnational musical formations. The story that I would like to tell you today begins appropriately here in Santa Barbara, California, with composer and performer Henry Eichheim. Eichheim was born in Boston but moved to Santa Barbara in 1922. And he's famous today mostly for the collection of musical instruments from many parts of Asia that he collected over, many years in which he traveled to different countries in Asia and brought back those instruments, which are now preserved at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Um, uh, it was obviously Eichheim was obviously very proud of his instruments, and he was displaying them and performing on them for visitors, and he also included them in some of his compositions. Erich Eichheim is his music, at least, is almost forgotten today, And he also has some bad reputation for being not particularly creative, and I will say a few words about that in a moment. But Eichheim was really, really important for the development of Gagaku in the West for a number of reasons, which are listed here. So again, the collection of instruments which made it possible for several people, composers, musicians, audience members, to be exposed to Gagaku. He also listened to actual Gagaku performances live in Japan in the 20s, at a time in which most people from the West uh, were not interested in doing so, or if they were actually exposed to Gagaku, they wrote like scathing reviews about how horrible the sound of this music was. And the third point here is particularly important, I think, because Henry Higham, at least to my knowledge, is the first composer to write Gagaku-inspired music already in 1921, and that was before Japanese composers began to use Gagaku elements to make new music for Western instruments. And this is something that I would like to say a few words in a moment. Eichheim was also interested in learning about music, Asian music, and Gagaku in particular, and he had several meetings with musicologist Tanabe Hisao in 1922 and also more extended, apparently, in 1928. And finally, Eichheim was influential for the promotion and study of knowledge of Asian musical tradition, including Gagaku, among junior American composers, which became something that became influential in itself. And these composers, again, created their own networks and contributed to expanding both the possibilities of the adoption of Gagaku in the West and also a number of other, possibilities. So, something that I would like to emphasize about Eichheim is that he's been criticized for being kind of a romantic Orientalist and nothing more, very superficial sound or musical impressionist. I would like to say that, whatever the judgment that we can give today about his music, which is again rarely heard, um, Eichheim was trying to really find new forms and new expressions, new sounds in music and bring them to a Western audience. And he found his inspiration in different types of Asian music. So he was not about, finding or creating like picturesque musical sketches, but really trying to find new and more free and flexible, as it's written here, forms and expressions. And I think in this sense, I think it should be re-evaluated. Um, the discovery of Gagaku instruments is in fact the first way in which Westerners were exposed to Gagaku. Um, there were no performances of Gagaku music outside of Japan and outside of the Japanese Empire, let's say, until 1959. That is the first world tour of the musicians of the Imperial Household Agency in Japan, when they performed in California, in other parts of the US and Europe and elsewhere. So that is the first time that I've been able to identify. But so prior to that, either Westerners went to Japan and tried to, found a concert, or they listened to recordings, or otherwise they were just exposed to musical instruments and whatever information was available about them concerning their extension, their intonation, their scales, and so forth. But of course, just trying to figure out a type of music only from the instruments has obvious limitations. But this is how it began in the second half of the 18th century. Um, about listening to Gaku performances, I already said something, so I will avoid any comments here. But again, it's interesting that Eichheim was so keen to listen to live music and learn live Gagaku, and learn about it. Um, which brings us about live performances. I mentioned the Japanese Empire because we do have some scant records about official Gagaku musicians from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo being dispatched to imperial shrines in the Japanese colonies. Here I make a reference to Dairenjingu in Dalian, present-day Dalian in China, um, and there are again references here recorded by Robert Garfias about musicians Gagaku musicians from Japan teaching Gagaku instruments to amateurs in Manchuria, again during the Japanese Empire. But very little is known about this, and very little is known about the impact of Gagaku in the Japanese Empire, except for some aspects of the Japanese cultural propaganda at the time, which I will return to in a few moments. So live Gagaku in the West until the 1990s basically was a very unusual, a very rare and precious occasion. I mentioned the world tour of the Gakubu of Kunaicho, Japanese Imperial Household Agency, in 1959. There was another tour in the early 1980s. And like I said, after the 1990s, these performances by various orchestras, not necessarily the one from the Imperial Household Agency, but others, including Reigaksha and others, became more and more frequent. But again, we're not talking about something that happens every month. I mean, it's every few years there is a performance, and these events are very important and very much appreciated outside of Japan as well. So in this sense, the performance that I was fortunate enough to be able to organize of the Hideaki Bunno Gagaku Ensemble here at the University of California, Santa Barbara and at Stanford University in March 2019 was a major and I would say historically rare event because we didn't have a live performance of Gagaku Orchestra here in California for 20, 30 years at least. I did say a few things about the early recordings. This is something that is understudied. Professor Terauchi Naoko in Japan has done research about the early recordings, and she has been trying to trace the tempo and the speed. And she has found some interesting things, in the sense that in early recordings, the Gagaku music was performed at a faster speed, especially towards the end of the compositions. Here, I would like to point out to the fact that we don't know much about, first of all, how many early recordings were made. We do know about the one in 1903, that is the first one that we know about. And especially, we don't know, again, how many copies were sold, to who listened to this music, and, and why. This becomes an issue, an important issue, because especially here in California, where not all temples and shrines of the Japanese American communities, not all of them were able to sustain Gagaku ensemble. It is possible that some of them had, they used recordings for the ceremonies, but I haven't been able to identify any record, any mention of that. But it's still a possibility. So it would be interesting to explore the spread, the diffusion of these early recordings. In terms of early live Gagaku performances here in California, musicology Anthony Shepard, who wrote a magnificent book about the role of Japanese music in the American imagination, as part of this larger project of the understanding of Japanese culture within Orientalism and all that. But music is rarely brought up, and Shepard wrote this magnificent book. And Shepard writes that, and I quote, "It is likely that Aikam Setenraku was the first Entenraku, that's how he misspelled it, was the first representation of Gagaku ever heard in the United States." this composition, about which I will say a few words in a moment, was widely performed in the US, in Europe, and also in Japan in the 1920s and early 1930s. I should also say that it is likely, though, that the orchestral version of a tendaku by Konoe Hidemaru had a much larger audience. For example, here in California in 1937, Konoe performed at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles to a huge audience. And here I have the snippet from the Japanese language newspaper of Southern California, the Rafu Shimpo, that writes about this event. Hollywood Bowl is written like Seri in Boru. It's kind of a mistranslation of the name. But again, this is kind of interesting that large audiences were exposed to some kind of sound or structure based on Gagaku, but again, not to original instruments. Now, musicologists have tended to forget, I should say, the fact that here in California there was a large Japanese American community since the late 1800s. And these communities were served by a number of religious organizations, several of which adopted Gagaku as part of their liturgies. I'm referring in particular to the Jodo Shinshu Nishi Honganji or Honganji branch, which was still is particularly active here in California under the name of Buddhist Church of America. Because again, Jodo Shinshu, especially at Nishi Honganji, there is this long tradition of using Gagaku for important Buddhist ceremonies. About which Ono Sensei will present at this conference. And so there were like about 30 Buddhist churches here in California in the 30s, and some of them may have performed Gagaku there. Reverend Masao Kodani, a retired head priest of the Senshin Buddhist temple in Los Angeles, has done research, and he has found out apparently that Gagaku was performed indeed live in California, and not with Western instruments, but with original instruments already in the 1910s or around the time. And he has found costumes used by Gagaku musicians here in California in the 30s. And here I have a picture of one of those costumes, which was kindly loaned to the university here by Reverend Kodani. And it is also possible, like I said before, that some of these temples may have used recordings for their ceremonies, but we know very little about it, and a lot of these records have been lost because of the persecutions that the Japanese Americans were subjected to after Pearl Harbor. Here, this is the only picture that I've been able to find during the research for this paper. It's a procession of some Japanese priests playing Gagaku. This happened in 1933, and I assume it is in Los Angeles, somewhere there. Asai, the author of the article where this picture is from, seems to argue from the context of the of the discussion that this seems to refer to a Nichiren organization. I'm not aware of any Nichiren organizations here in California in the 30s performing Gagaku, but who knows? But anyway, this is the proof that live Gagaku was existed in California at the time. Now, another possible thread or line of research is the role of early Shinto shrines in California that existed here since 1900, really, and continued until 1941, where all the Shinto shrines were basically destroyed as part of the anti-Japanese persecution, which resulted in the relocation of the Japanese communities in California to internment camps. I've been able to identify a number of Shinto shrines or Shinto-related organizations such as Konkokyo and Tennikyo that used Gagaku as part of their liturgies. Here I have a few pictures of shrines that I've been able to identify. Um, so we should not think that these temples and shrines were only for Japanese or people of Japanese heritage, because already in the 30s we have documents stating that, and I quote one of them here, stating that there were many Americans, I mean non-Japanese, we should say white Americans perhaps at this time, who were interested in the Japanese communities, who were interested in Japanese Buddhism, and they were sometimes gravitating around the temples and perhaps also the Shinto shrines. Which makes it possible that many or some non-Japanese heritage Americans were also exposed to the music that took place at these temples and shrines, including, Gagaku. But again, we don't know much about this. I should say that scholars, when they study the music of the Japanese American communities, especially before World War II, they tend to focus on the most popular types of music, which is basically sankyoku. So it's koto, shamisen, and shakuhachi, maybe some nagauta from kabuki, maybe some no plays. And that was the prevalent music at the time. But as I just said, Gagaku was also present, maybe in a small form. And again, we don't know much about it. Now, with internment, a lot of things, documents, objects were destroyed, and that affected Gagaku in particular because of its association with the imperial court, and therefore at this time with the Japanese militarism and imperialism. So many things related to Gagaku, whatever existed, may have been lost or even been destroyed. Here is a picture that I was able to find, and we see two young people packing stuff before, again, being deported to an internment camp. And we see the lady here putting away koto. I cannot tell if this is koto used in Gagaku, but it's certainly a possibility. Now, after World War II, Gagaku was revived in California in different ways and by different organizations. I should say perhaps the first one is the Gagaku Ensemble at the University of California, Santa Barbara, directed by Robert Garfias in the late 50s. And then in the late 60s, we have Reverend Kodani, whom I already mentioned, who started a Gagaku project at his temple called Kinnara Ensemble. Reverend Kodani has been incredibly influential in promoting Japanese music here in California, and not only for Japanese American communities. I mean, the huge development of taiko groups is something that was started by him as well. And the Tenikyo Church in Los Angeles, directed by Mitsuru Yuge, or Yuge Mitsuru, was also influential in this. And then these three groups began to collaborate together in a very lively environment. And other Gagaku ensembles are developed in Northern California in particular. Okay, now it's time to say a few words about the mediations. What happened? How did Gagaku come to California, right? Or how did non-Japanese heritage people, how did they get interested in Gagaku? So, of course, we have many nameless, unfortunately, at the moment at least, people who brought Gagaku to California and performed it. But then we do know about American composers who were attracted by it. And we also know, to an extent, who were the Japanese scholars and musicians from whom they learned. So let me say a few things about some of them, at least to the extent that I've been able to reconstruct the various lineages. So the first person we should talk about is really Tanabe Hisao, the founder, in a way, of musicology in Japan, and the one who really spread knowledge of Japanese music all over the world, especially by a book that he wrote originally in 1929, Japanese Music, which was reprinted several times. I think it's still in print somehow. I think Japan Foundation now distributes it. It's a very small book, and in a way, if I may say so, is rather superficial. But again, that was the starting point of a serious consideration for Japanese music. And so Tanabe was interesting because of his, I mean, he was not just reconstructing or Gagaku or Japanese music or just making knowledge about this available. He was framing that knowledge in a particular context that, and that's the context of musicology and ethnomusicology at the time, which again, of course, European music was seen as the top of the world musical achievements, and then there are other degrees, right? And Tanabe was aware of that, but he was also trying to elevate Japanese music and put it on par to Western music. So there is this deep awareness of the transnational discourse about music, and at the same time, a deep, we could say, like nationalistic attitude, which, by the way, was also shared by the Europeans and the Americans in this sense. So it is interesting to see the developments of Tanabe's thought, at least as it was published in English, by reading the different editions of this book, because it shows really different kind of geopolitical understandings, and some of it is here in the slide, and I will skip it. But part of the efforts by Tanabe involved including or making Gagaku, proposing Gagaku as the kind of musical lingua franca of the Japanese Empire. Tanabe argued that Gagaku was the only kind of music that was able to bring all of the disparate musics and the disparate people of the Japanese Empire together, precisely because of the history of Gagaku. So again, we have this international and or transnational awareness put at the service of, in this case, an imperial project. And I think that this is really something that is part of our understanding of Gagaku even today. Its transnational origin, but at the same time, the peculiarity that Gagaku, in its ancient form, exists only in Japan. So that is, generates a sense of pride and perhaps a sense of ownership, at least in some Japanese, with regard to Gagaku, which then again opens up the question about, what are non-Japanese to do with Gagaku? Can they really understand it? Can they really appreciate it? And I will say a few words about this towards the end. This is a long a slide with a long text, but let me just say that these kind of cultural policies during the Japanese Empire trying to promote Gagaku were not really successful. But after World War II, where a different kind of geopolitical configuration emerged, and the U.S. in particular, United States, were trying to make sure that that Japan was solidly in part of the Western alliance. The U.S. in particular promoted all kinds of cultural exchanges, and that really resulted in a significant spread of both knowledge and fascination, I would say, for Gagaku. So again, cultural policies, even those that have some kind of nationalistic component, are obviously much more successful at a time of peace than at a time of war. And this is something that I think we should all remember. Here is another mediator that did play some important role, Shimoto Masatoshi of Tenrikyo in Honolulu, Hawaii. He's, of course, not in California, but again, he was a kind of a mediator between something that was happening in California and something that happened in Japan. He created a successful Gagaku ensemble in Honolulu, and he also taught Gagaku at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, until relatively recently. And Shamoto is also the one who exposed the American composer Alan Hovhannes and his wife to Gagaku for the first time in 1962. Togi Masataro is another very important mediator because he taught many musicians in Japan and also non-Japanese. And he wrote a book on Gagaku, which is one of the very few resources that we have in English if you want to start learning about Gagaku. And this book is quite interesting because it presents aspects from an insider, let's say, that not many others, many other authors talk about, like the construction of the instruments, like the movements of Bugaku dances and so forth. I already said a few things about UCLA Gagaku Ensemble and the role that Robert Garfias played with it. I mean, this was really important because many musicians or many people who became successful musicians were exposed to Gagaku thanks to the rehearsals and performances of the Gagaku Ensemble at UCLA. Here I mention a couple of names, but Frank Gehry, the architect, you would never imagine that he was a passionate performer of Gagaku. Even today, late in his life, I hear from my architect friends that he's really, really passionate about Gagaku. It's one of his most favorite conversation points, in fact. So, which is kind of interesting. Igor Stravinsky and Leonard Bernstein, the director and composer, were also exposed to Gagaku through the activities of this ensemble. Later on, Togi Suenobu taught at UCLA before he retired and went back to Tokyo, Meiji Jingu. And again, he did play an important role as mediator, way beyond, Los Angeles and California. Now, a few words about early Gagaku-inspired modern music. Here, I don't have time to discuss all the composers, but I would mention just a few names, and please take time to read the slides if you are interested. So, Eichheims, like I said, is the first modern composer to use Gagaku explicitly in his compositions in a piece called Entendaku, which is essentially a transcription which was done by Tanabe Hisao, by the way, of the classical Entendaku. As we can see here from the beginning of the score, this follows very closely, the Gagaku. Of course, without the effects that are related to the nature of the instruments of Gagaku. I mean, but the melody and the rhythm patterns are, pretty much the same. Now, something that is interesting here is that this is part of a larger, it's just one movement of a larger composition. So the goal here in Eichheim is not that of simply reproducing a tendaku as it is with Western instruments. The goal here is really to use Gagaku to create a new music. In this sense, I think Eichheim's Entendaku is vastly superior to Konoe's Etendaku in this sense, because again, Eichheim was looking for new possibilities and new types of creation. An attitude that was followed up by other composers. Henry Cowell, in particular, was a part of the entourage of Eichheim early on. He studied with Japanese musicians, Yamada Kitaro or Kitaro Yamada, the shakuhachi and other forms of Japanese music. And he wrote a piece, again, a large orchestra composition called Ongaku, in which the first movement is called Gagaku and is clearly inspired from Togaku music. He also, Cowell, also met with Tanabe Hisao and discussed with him ways of thinking about world music and the role of Japanese music and the role of America in it. And again, Cowell, so open to all kinds of non-European musics, still had this kind of sense of American exceptionalism, something that he says only in America it's possible. Which may or may not be true, of course, But again, this oscillation between a transnational perspective and a nationalistic perspective seems to be a common thread when we talk about Gagaku, and also perhaps when we talk about other kinds of music. Lou Harrison, a friend of Henry Cowell, was also deeply fascinated about East Asian music, including Gagaku, and he wrote a piece in 1961 for Piri, which is the Korean version of Shiriki, and the reed organ, which is the show in this case. Alan Hovhannes, this very prolific and very interesting and open, but at the same time very melodic composer, I think is the first composer ever to write new music for Gagaku instruments. That before Japanese composers started it in 1962 and later in 1968. John Cage, he didn't write for Gagaku, especially until the 70s. I mean, he wrote for show in 1991. But Cage has been very deeply related to Japan, and certainly he's one of the composers who may have oriented other composers and performers to listen to Gagaku. Minimalism is also, especially the beginning, something that might have been influenced by certain aspects of Gagaku, and especially the long tones of the show, as it's been pointed out, especially with regards to Lamont Young in his early career. Things changed dramatically in the 70s, especially with the activities of Kido Toshiro, because that really made Gagaku into a contemporary form of music. And I will skip most of what is written here in these slides. But again, with the international spread of Gagaku, then something that comes up, like I said before, is really what is the cultural identity? What kind of identity is Gagaku conveying to whom and why, right? When many non-Japanese are playing it, of course, all of us who play Gagaku are deeply respectful of the tradition, and I personally think, for me, it's kind of a gift, precious gift that I've been given, that I've been exposed to this ancient and precious tradition. At the same time, this ancient and precious tradition can also be used to create new sounds and new musical expressions, and that is not Gagaku anymore. And I don't think that the Japanese are, only have the monopoly on that. But again, this is a conversation that is probably worth having. Nobody would say, for example, that the German musicians are the best performers of Beethoven just because he was German. So this again is something that needs to be discussed and reevaluated. Here I have a long quote by Reverend Kodani, who's questioning, this again. He's Japanese himself, but he's lived in California for many years, and he's questioning, this connection between music, performance, and cultural ownership of that music. And this is very recently, composers and performers, Satori Shimizu and Manabe Naoyuki, I've been discussing about, what happens, what is the distinction or between performing classical Gagaku or performing Gagaku-inspired contemporary music, if it is the same person who does that, right? And here Manabe says that, himself, he kind of is split into two. When he plays Gagaku, he plays Gagaku. When he plays contemporary music, he plays contemporary music. And Shimizu then, concludes this conversation by, emphasizing the the need to overcome stereotypes, and stereotypes that tend to simplify the complex elements that go on in all types of musical activities, including Gagaku. So, so perhaps we could think that Gagaku is part, in a way, of the cultural heritage of humankind in general, precisely because of the international reach that it has as classical music of Japan, but also as a repertoire or a repository of new musical possibilities that has been used by many composers and performers all over the world. So in this sense, Gagaku goes way beyond Japan, and it's become a common patrimony of humankind in a sense. So it has become another kind of classical music because, again, it does not really belong to any specific place anymore. So in this sense, again, worldwide cultural heritage, but at the same time, what kind of cultural identity is Gagaku proposing or carrying forward for the next generations? This is something that we may want to discuss at some point later. Thank you very much for your attention. Here I have the references that I've used for this presentation, and thank you.